This is Cars and Bids, and today I am going to talk about my favorite recent sales of 90s cars. In fact, my 10 favorite 90s cars we've sold in the last 90 days. You see that? 90? Let's get started. Okay, these are my top 10 favorite 90s car sales in the last 90 days, and I've actually ranked them. So we're going to start with number 10 and move up to number 1, my very favorite 90s car sale in the last 90 days. And I should mention, by the way, number 10 is actually kind of cheating. They're two very similar cars that I thought I would group together, so there's really 11. But the two cars at number 10 and number 10, favorite 90s car sales last 90 days, this 1991 Ford Taurus sedan sold for $3,600, and this 1990 Ford Aerostar sold for $8,500. I am a big sucker for these early 90s crappy cars, to say that's what they are. They weren't crappy then, but by modern standards they are, and nobody thought to preserve them, but they've been preserved. And I would have given anything to review these two cars. The Aerostar was up in the Bay Area, it's like an 8-hour drive for me, and the Taurus was up in Oregon, which is a flight. But if you bought one of these, please bring it to Southern California so I can review it. The 91 Taurus I especially like. You know, the Taurus from that era was a really important car. It came out in 1986, and it was Ford making a big change and trying to modernize. And the other, General Motors and Chrysler were way behind, building boxy, rear-wheel drive, outdated crap. And Ford came out with this car that its appearance was kind of mocked when it first came out, and then it sold really well. And it really had an effect on changing Ford and changing Ford's path from then on. And there are not that many well-preserved first-generation Taurus models out there. They were only sold from 86 to 91, and this was final model year first-gen Taurus. It's a pretty special car. The problem is it sold for $3,600 because it's just not all that great. By modern standards, it's not that nice of a car. It wasn't that special, whatever. But I think these cars over time will start to become more and more appreciated. And I was thrilled to have both of these on the site. Just total relics. Cars that should never have been saved, but they were. And I just love, you pull up the interior picture and you could just remember what it was like to climb into the interior of a Taurus from that era or an Aerostar. And they're interesting to see now that have been preserved that well. Okay, next up, favorite 90s cars of the last 90 days. This is number 9. That would be this 1993 Volkswagen Corrado SLC. We've sold a few Corrados on Cars and Bids. In fact, we have auctioned 3. But this one was particularly special because it was a one-owner car. So this sold for $17,250. This was a V6 version. All of the 93 and 94 Corrados in North America were V6s. 92, they shared 6 cylinders and 4 cylinders, and before that, they were all 4 cylinders. But the V6 was the one that most people prefer. The 4-cylinder was supercharged, but the V6 has more parts available, seemed to be a little bit more reliable, and it was just a cool car, a V6 in a little hatchback this size. But again, the cool thing about this one was it was a one-owner car. The seller of this car had bought it new. And anytime you have a one-owner car that's been owned for that long, there's something humbling about it, running Cars and Bids and seeing people choose our platform to be the place to finally part ways with their car. This dude had this car 20 years. And finally, he was ready to sell it, and he entrusted it to us. And you know, Cars and Bids is a business. We're out to make money. You know, we have employees, we have things to do, costs to meet. But something like that happens, and I don't know, it's really special to me. The most sentimental and near teary-eyed I get when I think of Cars and Bids is when we get these long-term one-owner cars on the site, because maybe the seller doesn't think much about it. They're just trying to sell it in what they think is the best platform for it, and I agree. But for me, I'm thinking, you know, you could have sold this car 10 years ago. You could have sold it on Craigslist. You could have done anything with it, you know, crashed it, frankly. You could have bought and sold new cars over all these years, but you didn't, you know. You kept it, and now you've chosen us as the place to sell. Anyway, that is meaningful to me. It really, really is, as the guy who runs this business. But anyway, this is a cool car. $17,250 is what it sold for, which was big money for a Corrado, but you'll never find another one-owner Corrado. They didn't sell that many of these, probably only a few thousand over 5 model years in the US, and my guess is there's maybe only a few dozen left with their original owners. So it's a pretty cool car, pretty cool to see it sell on Cars and Bids. Okay, next up, number 8, favorite 90s car from the last 90 days. That would be this 1999 Plymouth Prowler. This was auctioned by none other than Hoovie of Hoovie's Garage, who I love as a seller on Cars and Bids because he takes the best photos and he sells with no reserve, which always leads to a great result, and that was the case here too. This Prowler sold for $24,000. I love the Prowler. Prowler came out, I think, in 97, and you know, the hero color was purple. But who would want a purple? I mean, the whole car was ridiculous, and then getting it in purple is even more ridiculous. But to me, that was the fun of the Prowler. And if I was getting one of these, I would never get anything but purple, or maybe one of the other crazy colors they did later. But Hoovie presented this Prowler really well. It was in decent shape, had some miles on it, but it was in nice shape. And it sold for $24,000. I just loved these cars. I've always referred to the Prowler as an automotive guilty pleasure for me, meaning that it was a car I knew wasn't that great, had a bad transmission, not that great of an engine, had a lot of parts bin stuff, but I just love it. Like exposed open wheels, this design, it was so daring. It probably took an enormous amount of cost, which they probably never recouped because they didn't sell that well, but I still love the Prowler. Even though I know it's not the fastest, I know it should have a V8 and a manual and blah, 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 I still love it. I think it's the coolest thing in the world, and I was happy when Hoovie sold his here, and I think we sold a few others, and every time a Prowler, we've auctioned 3, and every time a Prowler comes up, I get excited. And still every time I see one on the road, I kind of freak out as if I'm seeing an exotic sports car, even though they sell for like $17,000 to $30,000. So I can go get one, you know, it's not that crazy, but I think that they're really cool cars, and my guilty pleasure, I always say. So it's nice to see a Prowler on the site. And speaking of kind of American cars from this era, this 1996 Chevy Corvette Grand Sport we sold for $25,000. This is a really cool car. So I'm a weird one when it comes to Corvettes. Like everybody else, my favorite Corvette is the C2, the 1960s one. The split windows are amazing. But my second favorite Corvette is the C4. I just always liked how it looked. Now, I never liked the early C4s. Nobody really did. But the later ones, I think, are really, really, really good cars. I love the look. I love the interior. By the end of production, they had good powertrains. And the Grand Sport was the best of breed. The ZR1s were obviously the highest performers, but I just loved how the Grand Sports look. They were all blue with this white stripe and those little red notches over the front fender. They had red interiors, and this was the dream Corvette Grand Sport. It was a 6-speed manual. It was a coupe. I preferred the look of the coupes. Usually I'm a convertible guy, but these were just made to be coupes. It had 30,000 miles, and it was just kind of the dream Grand Sport. Unfortunately, this car wasn't sold with no reserve. If it was, I probably would have bid on it. I really, really love these cars. And, you know, selling for 25 grand, only because the C4 doesn't have that great of a reputation are these cars only worth 25 grand. I think this is a very, very special car. And, you know, C4s, they made so many of them over so many years, they'll probably never go way up in value. But to me, the C4 Grand Sport just looks the coolest, has the best interior, great powertrain, and I always love seeing Grand Sports come on Cars and Bids. Okay, next one, my favorite 90s cars from the last 90 days, this 1991 Nissan Skyline GTR. I love an R32. I owned an R32. It was a tremendously good car. My only gripe about that car was that it was right-hand drive. I'm not a big right-hand drive guy. I would prefer to drive on the normal side of the road for the country in which I live. But it drove so well. Now, this particular R32 GTR had an R33 motor swap. They were still RB26s, but the R33 had some upgrades that the 32s didn't have. This car was located in Canada, had 90,000 miles, but it brought a pretty hefty $34,000. There's still a lot of interest in these R32 GTRs. There's a lot of people who want them. This car was pretty clean. It had been modified, but not stupidly like some of the ones you see, which are just disappointing. And it looked pretty clean both inside and out. It was a special car, and I just will always have a soft spot for the R32. Even though I know the R33 and the R34 are technically better cars, blah, 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 the 32 was kind of the first in that trio, and it was the one that I had, and I still love it. And I'm glad to see that they're still doing well and bringing big money, even though the 33s had started to become legal. Okay, next up, my top favorite 90s cars of the last 90 days. I guess we're up to number 5. The AutoZam AZ1. So this car was here in San Diego, and I reviewed it for my YouTube channel, and that review went live with the auction. It obviously brought a lot of traffic to the auction. The car sold for $34,000, which was a record sale price for an AutoZam AZ1. But this car deserved it. Bright, good color. It was in incredibly nice condition. I know the owner of the car, and he had really kept it incredibly, incredibly well. It was also sold with no reserve, which I think always tends to get a little bit more action, a little bit more bids and money, and it took incredible good photos of it, which is really, really helpful for getting great money. And so it brought great money, but it deserved it. This is a really cool car. The AZ1 has never really been on my radar that much as an incredibly exciting, desirable car because it's so tiny and it's kind of almost too quirky for me, gull-wing doors, and it's ridiculous. But I drove this car for my video, and I was blown away by how well it drove. The shift action, the clutch action, it was amazing. It was fantastic. And yeah, it's really little in size. You kind of have to be shorter than me to drive it comfortably. But honestly, I mean, it was made by Mazda. They knew what they were doing in this era. They were making the Miata. They knew how to make a sports car. And this really is a pretty nice sports car. I think you throw a better engine in this car and it really comes alive and becomes like one of the more desirable little sports cars from this era. But it was a cool car, and I'm glad we sold it. And I'm glad we got good money for the seller, and I'm glad the buyer got a truly great AZ1. Okay, next up, we are on my fourth favorite 90s car from the last 90 days. That would be this 1999 Porsche Boxster. Now, a 99 Boxster, manual transmission, 54,000 miles, doesn't seem like anything interesting, but this car had an ocean jade metallic exterior and a nephrite green interior, meaning it's teal on the outside over green on the inside. And as a result, it sold for $19,000. Now, I say that the price was a result of the color because it was. Boxsters from this era, base Boxster with 54,000 miles sells for, I don't know, $10, $11, $13,000 maybe. This one sold for 19 because it's an incredibly rare and cool color. Now, I want to be clear, it's not a particularly attractive color. This teal over green is not a great combination, but in the Porsche world right now, interesting, crazy colors are all the rage. And if I was buying one of these, I would buy this one. Like, I don't think it's an attractive car, but I love how special it is, and it's special and neat and exciting, and I love browsing through this gallery and just looking at these green seats and green carpeting and green dashboard and thinking, what was going on? But it's really, really cool. And it sold for good money as a result of that. But talk about weird and interesting cars. This is one of those. Not beautiful, but way more special than your traditional silver over black. And I love this car as a result. Okay, next up, my number 3 favorite 90s car from the last 90 days, that would be this 1994 Land Rover Defender. I love the Defender 90, the NAS, the North American Specification Defender 90. And this one sold on Cars and Bids for $73,000, which is just insane. But this is the NAS Defender market these days. Off-road SUVs have become incredibly hot and incredibly highly desired, and the market is rising on all of them. Now, the Defender was sold in North America, the Defender 90, for 3 model years, 94, 95, and 97. It used to be that the first 2 model years were the less desirable ones. They had a manual transmission. Most people with Defenders prefer an auto. It's not like a Porsche where you're throwing it around curves. You just want to kind of sit in and drive. But even the manuals have started to shoot up in value. Now, this particular NAS Defender was a very desirable example because it had a massive overhaul in 2019. It had a huge, everything was upgrading, nothing was left untouched, including it had a frame replacement. And rust is a big problem for these cars. Rust is a big culprit in causing issues for these cars long term and obviously destroying them. And so a frame replacement into a galvanized frame that won't rust anywhere near as easily, that's a really, really, really big deal. But other than that, this car was also finished in the best color, which is AA yellow. That is the color of mine. I also own one of these. And that's debatable. A lot of people don't like the yellow, it's too flashy, whatever, but I always buy cars in the press color, the hero color from the advertisements, and that was this color. And this was just a really, really nice example. It had almost 90,000 miles, which is getting up there for these Defenders. They really bring all the money when they're a lot lower than that, but this was a really, really nice example. And it deserved a good sale, and it got a good sale. $73,000 for a 94 with 90,000 miles. That's big money. And I love these cars, and I'm so happy whenever an NAS Defender comes on Cars and Bids. Okay, next up, we are down to the final 2, my favorite 90s cars from the last 90 days, and I must admit, the last 2 of these, I really wanted to buy, and I didn't bid on them because I have a policy where I only bid on cars if there's no reserve on the site, because otherwise I have kind of more information than the other bidders. I really wanted these cars, and so one is this 1995 BMW 318i Touring. Which was converted into an M3, and it sold for $25,250. This car is really special for me. I really like the E36 Touring. That was the station wagon version of the E36 3 Series, which was sold from 1992 to 1999. They never sold the Touring version of this car in America, but I feel that the E36 Touring is probably BMW's best looking wagon ever, except for maybe the E34 5 Series Touring, which was like a little bit earlier, 89 and 95. But I really wanted this car. Now, the cool thing about this one was it wasn't just a regular 3 Series Touring, it was an M3 conversion. So BMW never did an E36 M3 wagon. They did an M3 sedan, an M3 coupe, and an M3 convertible, but never a wagon. And this guy who's selling the car, I guess, converted the whole thing. And not just the engine swap, which is cool, and the manual transmission, but he did the rocker panels, he did the side molding that says M3, he did the M3 wheels, and best of all, he resisted the temptation to do other stupid modifications. He just made it look super, super clean, like it would, like a factory E36 M3 wagon would have looked, and that's what I wanted. So this car, I'll tell a little story. This car came into our submitted team, and I was the first one to see it. And he was asking for a certain reserve. And I thought to myself, I'm not even going to fight him on the reserve. I'm just going to put it up, because if it doesn't hit the reserve, then I can just buy it afterwards. You know, oh, hey, buddy, can I? Well, of course, it's a really well done build. And it sold, not only did it hit the reserve, it sold for way over, and it deserved to, and it's a really cool car. But I was really kind of hopeful that I would end up with it. Congratulations to whoever did buy it. When you're going to sell it, maybe send me a note. I would be interested in getting this car. My only wish is that I wish it was Estoril Blue, but you can't be picky with these things since BMW never made it from the factory. And finally, we're down to the last one, the number one 90s car I like the most from the last 90 days. And that would be this 1991 Acura NSX. I really wanted to buy this car. I don't have an Asian car right now, which is unusual for me. I've had a lot of them over the years. I had a Skyline, and I had my Nissan S Cargo, and I had a Land Cruiser, and my Kia Stinger. I've had a lot of them, but I don't have one. And I'm kind of thinking, what would I want? And the answer is a nice red early NSX, and this one shows up on the site. And I didn't really think that until it showed up on the site. And then I saw it there sitting there on the site for like days. You know, as other auctions closed, it would move higher and higher, close to the top. And I was thinking, I want that. And the next day it would be even higher. I really want that. And unfortunately, I hadn't realized that when the car came into us, so I would have maybe tried to talk him into no reserve. I would have bought it. I would have loved to have this car. But it brought $71,000, very much a market correct price for a car with 51,000 miles. This is exactly the type of car I look for, something with a little bit of miles on it. Not a ton, not 100,000, but also I don't like buying the 10, 20,000 mile stuff and paying a premium, because I really like to use my cars. You know, my dog rides in the Ford GT, and I put my baby in my Audi RS2, etc. So this was like the perfect car for me, and I really wanted it. $71,000 for a 92 NSX. I mean, I remember when these cars were half that or less, and it's a lot of money, but I think we're gonna look back in 10 years and say, man, remember when you could get one for $71,000? They're just cool, and you look at these pictures and you're just reminded of how damn cool this car is and how special it is, and it drives amazingly too. And these cars, they get a lot of hype in the enthusiast world, and I think they deserve every minute of it, every little bit of hype. So I wish I had gotten this one. I kind of want one just generally. It's a really cool car, but those are them. Those are my favorite 90s cars from the last 90 days. We saw a lot of cool 90s stuff on Cars and Bids, and I was especially happy to see these 10, 11 cars come through. But I always like the cool 90s stuff. It really speaks to some of my passions. And it's nice to see that other people agree and that they bring big money and a lot of interest and a lot of enthusiasm on the site. So there you go. Best 90s cars last 90 days.